Thank you, Dwight, and we appreciate all of you that are here tonight. I believe we have almost as many here tonight as we had this morning. But anyway, a lot of people are out of town and a lot of people sick. But we're so thankful and grateful that God has afforded us the opportunity to be here tonight, and hopefully everybody will be back next week. And I appreciate the songs that Dwight has led tonight because they certainly complement the lesson that I'm going to share with you over the next few moments. You know, a lot of times in our lives, we are guilty of making assumptions or perhaps deductions that are not quite right. And sometimes our deduction, even about suffering, is also questionable. We have a lot of miscalculations in life. And that really is what the word deduction actually means, is to miscalculate. Your reasoning is not quite right. There's something wrong with your deduction. And in the book of John, the 9th chapter, verse 1 through 3, the Bible tells us that the disciples of Jesus Christ in this particular setting had made a wrong deduction. They miscalculated what was going on. And I want to share that with you tonight as we begin our lesson together. In the book of John 9, verse 1 through 3, the Bible said as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, that seems a little unreasonable question anyway. I mean, what could the man have had to do with it? I mean, he hadn't even been born yet. But you know, sometimes our miscalculations are so real in our mind. And like a lot of people believed back during the days of Jesus, that if bad things happened in your life, it was attributable to one thing: you. You were the culprit. If bad things happened in your life, you must have done something that is wrong, and God brought this on you. And so they're saying that was it this man or his parents? Perhaps his parents had done something that caused this man to be born blind. But we know, according to the book of Ezekiel, the 18th chapter, the Bible says that the son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, and neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. In other words, you can't control your children totally and altogether. Is there anyone in here tonight that can control your children, every move that they make? You see what I'm talking about? And some of you don't control them as well as others. No, I'm teasing about that. But the point I am making is the fact that parents are not guilty because of something that their children might do. God does not hold you accountable. He doesn't. And so they're reasoning in their mind that this man's blindness was attributable to either something that he had done or his parents, that he was born blind. And so Jesus now points out the miscalculation. And he says, neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. Now, I know that sounds a little strange to us. Sometimes we wonder why things happen in life. And, we often wonder why certain people meet with certain fate and others meet with maybe a different type of fate. But it is for sure that the deductions that these disciples had made were incorrect. They were. Some people say that, they were correct. No, they were incorrect in their deducting it, because it was not the fault of anyone, but that God is going to use this man to perform one of the great miracles of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. And you will find this whole story laid out for you in the book of John 9. And you'll remember where Jesus told this man, as he made spittle out of the dirt and the mud, and told him to place it on his eyes and go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And that's exactly what he did. And his eyes were open, and Jesus performed the works of God. Someone said that sometimes your deductions and truth dine at separate tables, and they do. One of the most expensive things you could ever do is pay attention to the wrong people. You know, sometimes when you hear things like, as they begin to play out in John chapter 9, but even in modern society today, people can say something and somebody else picks up on it and they say, well, you know what? It must be right, what you're saying. And so we put a lot of things together and we deduct a lot of things that just may not be so at all. Someone said maybe if we tell people the brain is an app, they'll start using it. Maybe they will, I don't know, but I don't assume that either. I don't. We need to understand that we have to be humble because we could be wrong. How many of you have ever been wrong in your assumptions of certain things? I'll be honest with you. I look at these hands go up. They're being honest tonight about it. Well, and that's great. Learn to admit your mistakes before someone else exaggerates the story. And you know, people love to exaggerate. People love to talk about how bad they have it. In the book of Acts chapter 23 and verse 1, the council particularly had thought that Paul was really a troublemaker and that he was stirring up trouble. But he says, and Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God unto this very day. So Paul is making a defense for himself for what he has done. And even though the others had miscalculated, they were like maybe Naaman in the Old Testament. In the book of 2 Kings chapter 5 and verse 11, you remember Naaman was a man who had developed leprosy. And leprosy was a very dread disease back during the days of King Solomon and during the days of the kings and even during the days of Christ. We know that Jesus healed lepers. And Naaman wanted to be healed. He wanted to be able to have a clean, pure body free of leprosy. But when the word came to him that he was to go and dip in the river Jordan 7 times, it did not set well with him. Factually speaking, if you look in verse 11, the Bible says, but Naaman was wroth, that he was so angry he could chew nails. I mean, he was so mad. And he went away and said, behold, I thought, I deducted, but I miscalculated. I deducted that surely he will come out to me, God's prophet, and stand and call in the name of the Lord his God and strike his hand over this place and recover the leprosy. But God didn't do it that way. You know, sometimes in life when we feel that God doesn't do things the way that we want it done, you pray about certain things. And when God doesn't answer your prayer specifically like you prayed it, you deduct maybe that God just didn't hear our prayer. The wicked, he says, that is Naaman, go unpunished all the time. Have you ever heard people say that? They say that in today's world. He prays, and Job does, he prays and he tells Zophar, one of the 3 friends, when he's going through this terrible dilemma in his life, to stop being so depressing. Sometimes we try to paint the picture worse than it really, really is. It was kind of like Elijah in the Old Testament. He thought everybody had bowed the knee to Baal, to an idolatrous god, but they had not, and God reassured him. Notice what we find in Job 21 and verse 27. He says, behold, I know your thoughts, God speaking, and the devices which ye wrongfully imagine against me. You know, people do make miscalculations about God. I want to talk to you briefly tonight about 3 wrong deductions we make about suffering. Now, I know that sounds a little strange. God is responsible for all the bad things that are happening in my life. Now, I don't believe that, but that's a deduction that people make. It's a miscalculation on their part. They, like those in the Old Testament, and maybe during the days of the early church, there were a lot of people that thought all these bad things that we're going through. I mean, the church is undergoing persecution. And they're doing that simply because God doesn't love me anymore. He doesn't care for me. Well, there's breaking news for those of us who are children of God. Then when we see these bad things going on, and there are many, many of them, that God still loves us. He's still in tune with life and living and what is going on in your life daily. We have bombings and we have shootings all over America. It is happening all the time. Think about a Walmart in the early morning hours and how these people went to work. And a gunman comes in and takes the life of 7 of them. Little did they know that night that they would lay their eyes on the bed for the last time. But some people, I heard some people on television blaming God. God, why did you allow this to happen? And so when we think about the murders that took place up in Idaho, the young people that were killed, stabbed to death, no suspect. Terrible, terrible thing, isn't it? But people have a way of blaming God. But you know what? It isn't the work of God. It is the work of a devilish mind, of a satanic force in the world in which we live. We have no right to blame God. That is not the answer. That is a miscalculation, for God is with us. We have been singing about that tonight. But there's another deduction that really is a misconception on our part. That is, God ought to put an end to all of my suffering. If the truth were known tonight, maybe some of you are suffering. You came on to worship because you love God. But maybe you're hurting, maybe you're suffering in some way or another, unknown to all of us that are here tonight. Maybe you or maybe not. But I know that there are people in the world that believe if God is really alive, then shouldn't he put an end to all of my suffering? Why am I having to go through this? Well, let me see if I can help you understand. And it is a miscalculation to think that God should put an end to all of our suffering. The question has long been with many, many people, why does God allow human beings to suffer so much? One of the first questions we ask, whether it maybe you found out you had cancer or you had debilitating heart disease, or maybe you had the death of a loved one, and maybe the first question you ask is, why, God? Why? I'm not saying it's wrong to ask God why. I'm not sure that God's going to answer or give you an immediate answer to the question, or perhaps your own deduction. Even on the cross, Jesus asked why, didn't he? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And God didn't give him an answer. The only answer he gave when he petitioned God to remove the pain of death and the sting of death and death itself was no. God said no to his own beloved Son. When you go back to that story of Job, and it's a very interesting story, the whole 42 chapters of that book say much about life and living. And it says much about the character of a man that God called perfect and upright. There was something that was so unusually different in the life of Job that you don't find in the world in which you and I live. It is the story about the problem of human suffering. King David, one of the great kings of all time, in Psalms 119, verse 67 and following said, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray." Have you ever really thought about that? Maybe God allows you to suffer to keep you from going astray. Now, I'm not trying to get into the mind of God tonight. I'm just simply telling you what David said. He says, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray." And so God afflicted me. God allowed these things to happen to keep me from going further into the depths of sin. But now, he said, "I keep your word, and you are good, and you do good." And in verse 71 of that same long psalm, actually it's the longest psalm in all of the Bible, Psalm 119, it would do you well to read the entirety of it. But David said, "It is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn your statutes." You know, you learn a lot through pain, don't you? You do. You learn a lot, and you learn how to help other people who are going through great trauma in their bodies as well. It has been said that faith is the bridge between where I am and where God is taking me. You know, we don't know where God's taking us. We really don't tonight. Well, we eventually want to go to heaven, I understand that, but we don't know what we're going to have to go through in this life. We may have to suffer much. But when you think about the fact that God is such a God of love, and He's watching over you, and He's going to help you get through it, and we know that all things, Paul says in the book of Romans 8 and verse 28, we know that all things work together for good to them that love the Lord, to them that are called according to His purposes. He didn't say one thing always works out for us, but he said the culmination of those things will work out for our good. And we have to believe that. And not take a position that says, well, you know, why doesn't God take away all of my suffering? There are purposes for it. We need a hard knock, unbreakable faith in God. We need to be like Job of old, who said that even though he slays me, yet will I honor him. And if God is for us, Paul said in Romans 8 and 31, if God is for us, who can be against us? That's why he wrote to this young minister named Timothy in 2 Timothy 1 and verse 12 and said, for this reason I suffer these things, but I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed, and I am convinced that he is able to guard all that I have entrusted unto him to this very day. If God is for us, who can be against us? I like the words of Jeremiah. I told you he was one of the great prophets of old, and he certainly was. And in writing to the children of God, he said in Jeremiah 31 and 25, God speaking, I will refresh the weary and satisfy the faint. Another deduction, last of all. God doesn't care about the pain I'm enduring. Not only does he not take it away, and then God's out there, but why am I having to go through this? But then we ask, if God doesn't care about the pain that I'm enduring, why am I serving him? God does care about your pain. I used to get tickled at Bill Clinton, who always said, I feel your pain. I don't know how much pain he really felt. But I know one thing, that God feels our pain. He knows our pain. And in the 4th chapter of the book of Mark, in verse 38, the disciples were out on that little sea of Galilee. And there was a storm that had arisen. It wasn't uncommon for it to happen. Just about every afternoon, it would come up and it would start raining. We used to live down close to the Gulf Coast in Buna. Actually, it's where Allison is from, Allison Rader. And almost every afternoon, Allison, there would come up a little shower, sometimes a little storm that would blow in from the Gulf. And what would happen is the fact that on the Sea of Galilee, it was nestled between mountains, and there would be a wind that would come along with clouds filled with moisture, and it would rain, and it would storm. The wind would blow, and the rain would beat upon ships, and it looked as though this was really intensifying. And so the disciples go back to the hinder part of the ship, and they find Jesus back there sleeping on a pillow, and they awakened him and said unto him, Master, don't you care that we are about to perish here? Jesus cared. He came to the helm of the ship, and he said, Peace be still. And there was a calm like you would find on a sunny day in the summer on a pond. It was that calm. O ye of little faith, Christ would say. Long has been the problem of pain and suffering. But sometimes you must hurt in order to know. Fall in order to grow, and lose in order to gain. And because most of life's greatest lessons are learned through pain. They are. The way that we really diffuse, I guess you could say, our disappointment in life is hanging on to hope. And there is hope for the hurting. You know, whatever we have to suffer in this life, Paul says when he wrote to the Corinthian church, he said, is not worthy to be compared to the glory that God shall reveal in us. You may be going through suffering tonight. Take heart. Take hope. And lean upon God. He knows where you are. And the Bible says that we're to cast our cares on him, for he cares for us. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. He does care. We sing about it, don't we, often? Does Jesus care? That's words of the writer, but then there is a resounding in the chorus that says, oh yes, he cares. I know he cares, for his heart is touched with my grief. In the book of Psalms 55, like you find in 1 Peter 5:7, David says something similar. He says, cast your cares on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will uphold you. But he will never leave you nor forsake you. Joshua 1 and verse 5. I think this is a very interesting statement that Paul makes about life when he considers suffering. And he says, unless I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelation that God has given unto him, he said, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger from Satan. Notice this, not from God, but a messenger sent from Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. So Paul accepted it. Every long last dream led me to where you are. Someone said, and others who broke my heart, they were like northern stars pointing out my way into your loving arms. This much I know is true, that God blessed the broken road that led me straight to you. Have you ever thought about the fact that had you not undergone some kind of trauma in your life, would you be sitting here in this church house tonight? Would you be a Christian? I always thought about the death of my mother when I was just a young boy. And there were questions I had at that time. Why, God? Why'd you allow this to happen? But the more that I have grown through the years, I've come to the realization that it was God who allowed things like that to happen, and other things all in my life that have led me to where I am now. And I can say, with David, it was good that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. I don't know that I'd have ever been a preacher of the gospel. Don't know that. But I know that God used the brokenness of my heart to lead me to where he wanted me to be. And he heals the brokenhearted, and he binds up their wounds, according to Psalms 147 and verse 3. And God is faithful, even when his children are not. You see, Christ is beside me. He is before me. He's behind me. He is within me, and he is above me. And he says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Hebrews 13 and verse 5. And a little while longer, the wicked one will be no more. That's the great comfort that we have, isn't it? In Psalms 37 and verse 10. And just learn to trust God. Assume nothing. I could agree with you, but then we'd both be wrong. What if your assumption is wrong? And I agreed with you. Your deductions might be wrong. For there is a way that seemeth right unto man, but the end thereof is the way of death. The highway to hell, we often say, is paved with good intentions. But you know what? The highway to hell is often paved with deductions and miscalculations as well. But there's one thing that we can know for sure, and that is about our salvation. And you need to know it. No matter how far you have gone down the wrong road, you can always turn around and come back to God. That's what God's plan of salvation is all about, isn't it? And when we stray from God, he allows us to come back home to him through a penitent heart and prayer. And that's the invitation that we offer to you tonight as we stand and as we sing.